Hi and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is episode 61, a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK Police Force. Hopefully you found it interesting so far. Welcome. If this is your first time, you might want to go back and start from the beginning. Alternatively, you can just dip right into whatever episode, and welcome back if you're following the series as it goes along. Thanks very much for the downloads. Once again, gone very well this week, so thank you for that, and hopefully you're enjoying it. As you'll know, if you've been listening, we're very much into myself working on the dive team now, the Met Police dive team in London, and all that brings. So hopefully you found it interesting along the way. We're going to get started today with a similar sort of theme, but a different group that we worked with quite regularly. You may or may not have heard of it, particularly if you're not in the UK. And I'm talking about the National Crime Agency, the NCA. They're a government agency. They're technically not police. Well, they're not police. And their numbers are made up of various people from the civilian police and military world, really. Generally, they're sort of people that are very good at what they do. So there's certainly a lot of ex-police in there. People, sometimes they've retired, but more likely they've perhaps left the police, before they've completed their sort of 30-odd years. And generally they'll have been within a specialist role within the police. And the obvious ones are surveillance, firearms, and perhaps if they've been heavily involved in financial crime, perhaps working in the City of London or something like that. And the NCA, the National Crime Agency, it brings together specialists from all areas, really. Border force, ex-military, all sorts of people. They were set up, the NCA, to target and disrupt sort of serious and organised crime. They've been called various different things in the past, as most of these people have, including the police and the various units. I think I said it last week or a couple of weeks ago, constantly seem to be changing their names for the sake of it, but currently the NCA. So yeah, very good group of people, and I think of them as fitting roughly between, the police and the intelligence services, and by that I mean MI5, MI6. Somewhere in between there is where I would put the NCA. Now they do still rely on the police a lot for assistance, especially when it comes to the sort of arrest phase, because they don't necessarily have quite the capabilities when it comes to the police in terms of arresting bad guys, and certainly any of these sort of regional or national teams that travel around and need to instigate arrests on serious criminals in anywhere in the country tend to go to the local force there and then use the specialist firearms officers to carry out their arrests, in the attack phase, if you like, because these are serious people, and you can't just wander up in uniform and tap them on the shoulder and say, would you mind awfully, come in with me and I'll just pop some handcuffs on. It isn't going to work like that. These people regularly carry firearms. They can be very violent, not always, but it can be. So yeah, NCA and others tend to come to specialist firearms officers to use, because they are, exceptionally good at what they do in relation to that sort of stuff. We work with them quite a bit, particularly on big and sort of lengthy investigations. They have lots of resources. I mean, if you're in the NSA, you're probably sitting there thinking, no, I haven't, there's no overtime, and, we're stretched like everyone else. I'm sure they are, but they do have access to, some very, very Gucci kit, the utmost sort of sneakiest surveillance stuff, and quite often their surveillance is so specialist that they'll be used if you have a particularly aware target. So, for example, if you've been involved in the arrest of perhaps a bad guy, in a certain area, in a certain county, and the local surveillance have been used, that person is now, sort of very surveillance aware, which can make it more difficult to carry out surveillance on them, because they're particularly switched on. Although I have to say, the best surveillance teams, it wouldn't matter to them, and I guarantee that no matter how good you think you are at spotting surveillance, it's not like you see on the movies. It drives me crazy on the movies and on the TV when you see, they're carrying out surveillance on the TV, and the bad guy pulls out in his car, and then immediately, sort of one car behind him, the car pulls out as well, and switches his lights on and follows him. And then the person proceeds to give a sort of full running commentary holding a big obvious radio up to his mouth. It's just not like that at all. Your average person that was being surveilled would be driving along unaware that they're being watched by, perhaps, half a dozen different people. There'll be maybe 12 cars involved. There'll be motorbikes. There could be all sorts of different assets being used. There'll be people, in shops and on buses, they won't even see. So it's not like, and again, people that are aware, you'll see them sort of walking along and constantly looking behind them. That you just don't know what you're looking for. They're not going to see you. A good surveillance team, they won't be on the street. They're not going to be driving along behind you. They'll be in all sorts of sneaky ways. I won't go into too much detail, but a good SV team is definitely not going to show out, and your average criminal, in fact even the really switched on ones, are not going to know they're under surveillance. And one of the things they use, and in fact was used in this job I'm going to talk about today, was they've got a spotter plane, and I think they've got more than one. Fantastic piece of kit. We're all used to police using helicopters for surveillance, and quite often there's car chases and things, that you'd have a running commentary from the helicopter above. And sometimes that's safer. That can enable the sort of pursuing officers to back off a bit because the helicopter is following their target. But of course, generally, helicopters are noisy and they fly fairly low, so they're quite aware that they're there. It's not like they're sneaky, But one of the resources that the NCA uses is spotter plane that can be, very high. I'm not sure exactly how high, but probably, 2,000 meters or something up. It's got incredibly sensitive technical, filming abilities, and could happily be carrying out surveillance just the same way that a helicopter would. But the difference is it's so high you won't see it, you won't hear it. There's absolutely no way you're going to sort of spot that. And it looks very, sort of unobtrusive, just like any other, sort of light aircraft you might see. And people just aren't expecting that. And of course, drones as well are now being used more and more. They're so capable, and again, they can be incredibly high, way out of hearing range, So you're just not going to ping that something like that is looking at you. So they've got a lot of capability. And this job that we were involved in that I'm going to talk about today, it was a massive drugs job. I mean, the biggest drugs job I've ever been involved in terms of value and weight. And what they were dealing in, these guys that were importing drugs into the country, we're talking 200 kilos of cocaine. Now, to put that in perspective, the street value of cocaine, now it does fluctuate, but to give you an example, can quite often be, say, 40,000, UK pounds per kilo, roughly, would be the value. So 200 kilos of cocaine would be, in the region of £8 million. Now, I know I said I didn't take notes for this, but I have made a note of that because you're probably thinking, I've got really good maths for working out. I haven't, honestly. I've worked out the calculation, I'm writing it down. So yeah, massive job, 200 kilos, a huge job. And this operation had gone on for months and months. And they'd snagged all the sort of big players in terms of evidence, had all the evidence they needed, and they were at their strike phase where they were going to instigate the arrest. Now, I don't know for sure if they were using just their own people or whether they were using specialist firearms officers, but it was certainly near a school in London. And they instigated what I would call the strike. The vehicles come alongside and, they're boxed in, so they'll probably use a version of TPAC, the Tactical Pursuit and Containment. So you'll have a vehicle right up tight, police vehicle right up tight behind the target. Once the strike is called, you'll have one at the side. You'll almost certainly have one in front that will have braked very hard. So you effectively box it in either against a fourth car or maybe against, a barrier at the side of the road or something. That's certainly the plan. And when you do this, and you've probably seen it on the telly, it's absolute shock and awe. That's what you're looking for. These are serious people, don't forget, serious players that may have access to firearms or weapons or be very violent, as I've said. So you won't be doing this softly, and this is certainly my favourite form of arrest. And basically you're looking almost certainly at one or two or maybe all of those vehicles to pretty much crash into the target vehicle. Certainly, I've been in vehicles where we've given them quite a substantial tap, on the back of their car. I say tap loosely, or likewise, you've been in front of them, you just hoofed on the brakes to ensure that they crash into the back of you, because you are looking at total disruption. And when the cops are out of the car, as soon as I say cops, could be NCA, as soon as they're out of the vehicle, they're running forward, they're smashing all the windows with batons. They might be smashing the sunroof, they'll be shouting, there'll be lots of pointing, there might be guns pointing, depending on whether it's an actual armed arrest, which it isn't always. But what you are looking now, having been the person in that car, when I've done exercises, and I've played the bad guy and have had a sort of hard strike carried out against me, even though it's my friends and I'm fully prepared for it. When your car gets driven into from behind, that gets you looking, in your rearview mirror, turning round. At the same time, your car get hit from the front, and by the time you're thinking, what the hell's going on? People are out, smashing your windows. There's glass everywhere. They're shouting. These are big burly people, male or female, and like I say, shock and awe, that is the idea. You don't want that person to have a second to think, oh, I'll just take out this handgun I have conveniently stowed underneath my seat, or I'll prepare my knife or whatever it is for fighting off these guys. And to be honest with you, when this happens, sometimes, certainly in cases I've been involved in, the people are actually quite relieved it's the police, because they think it's rival drug dealers, in which case, they're not going to be, as dare I say it, nice as the police. They'll just shoot them or stab them straight away, whereas clearly the police don't do that. They instigated the strike on this vehicle. The 200 kilos of cocaine was in the boot of the car, and I don't actually know what happened at the strike, but clearly it didn't go quite to plan, because all three people got out of that vehicle and made good their escape. Now you might be thinking, well, that's a total failure on the part of the NCA or whoever carried out the strike. And I'd say you're partially right. The reality is you can train for things over and over. You can carry them out in, controlled conditions repeatedly and be completely happy in what you're doing and the plan and everyone's role, and you'd know other people's roles, so that if someone falls, you'd step in and take their role. You can do that till the cows come home. But what you cannot account for is members of the public. They will do things you don't expect. You would expect a car to get out of your way when you're driving at them. Maybe it doesn't. Sometimes members of the public will get involved if they think they're helping. Other times they'll get out because they just want to film it on their phone, and of course they're getting in the way, particularly on an armed job. You can imagine you're pointing guns and someone steps in front of you with a phone because they want to get it on Facebook or Instagram for likes. And of course no one quite knows how the person in the vehicle, the bad guy that you're looking to arrest, is going to react either. And again, I've had all sorts of reactions. Now, the one I've never had initially is violence. And I think that's because if you do the shock and awe bit right, it's so quick, they just have not got a chance to react. I've had big bad guys wee themselves when this happens. Literally guns are pointed at them, windows are smashed, and they get out and they've got a big wet stain on the front of their trousers. They wet themselves because it is a pretty frightening thing to experience, for sure. And don't forget, they're going to be on tenterhooks anyway. Well, I certainly would be with 200 kilos of cocaine in my boot. Do you know what I mean? So generally it's utter shock and complete compliance. Now after they're cuffed, and they realise it's police, and now suddenly they're all brave, for sure, then they might kick off and mouth off and what have you. But yeah, a reaction that I've never had, as I say, is violence. I've never had them fighting to start with. That only comes later. And particularly, of course, if they think you're not police, because they think their life is very much at risk. But anyway, whatever happened on this scenario, the three managed to escape. I suspect, it could have been a number of things, but, you only need, as I say, a member of the public's car to get in the way, or something that stops you getting too close. And just as you're calling that strike in those final few seconds, the bad guys realise what happened, and that's probably what happened in this scenario, because all three got out of the vehicle, hopped over the sort of fence, the hard shoulder, and were then away and running, and they ran down onto the nearest field, which they didn't realise, but it was actually a school field. Thankfully, I think it was the summer holidays, so the schools weren't in, there was no kids, but they basically ran across this big playing field, trying to make good their escape with hot pursuit of various police and NCA types, and what they wouldn't have known is also the spotter plane was up, so I saw all the footage of them running and being chased, and they had a decent head start on the guys. Basically, they headed for the bottom of this field, and at the bottom of this field, along the school field, there was quite a substantial river, and you can see where I'm going with this from the dive team point of view. So they ran across the river, but very clearly on the footage from the plane was them taking their phones apart as they ran across and waded through the river and dumping the SIM cards and the batteries and the phones in the river before they got out the other side, and then eventually basically got caught by police. I can't remember if they gave up or whether they were caught. I think it was a combination in the end. So we were called in and they basically said, it's of vital importance we get those phones back. Now, one of the slight issues is when we first turned up, and this is what happened to the guys that were pursuing, the water in that river was absolutely gin clear. I think it was sort of clay and chalk, so it made for good visibility, and it was only about 2 meters deep, but you could see every little detail on the bottom, see fish swimming about. Oh, it was a lovely scene, but unfortunately what that did, and we've had this a few times, is the guys had seen them throwing phones in, and they thought, well, we'll just wade into the water and get the phones, because those phones have got really good evidence on them. So the NCA guys got in, wading in the water to try and find it. Of course, what they didn't realise was at the bottom, maybe foot or 2 foot deep of thick clay sort of goo that was on the bottom, basically immediately got really, really stirred up and made such a mess that firstly they couldn't see anything, and almost certainly they made our life a lot difficult, and we believe probably stomped 2 or 3 phones right down into the mud. So now phones that were sitting there on the surface, that would have been the surface of the mud, which would have been relatively easy to find, have now been stomped 3 foot down into the clay. So it just made our life a whole lot harder. And of course we would regularly say to people, please don't do that. But I get that, you're involved in the chase, your blood's up, adrenaline's running, and you're trying to do it for the right reasons. So when we first turned up at this scene, we all remarked on, wow, look how clear this is. But equally, we could see that the second we got in, it was going to turn into a big sort of clay soup, which is exactly what happened. So we decided to run a double diver jack stay on this, which is a bit unusual in that it is what it says. It has 2 divers on the same jack stay. If you remember, jack stay is the rope, the weighted rope that's stretched across the bottom as your reference point that your hand is on when you're searching, and you put a diver either side of it. And the divers work either side searching along the jack stay, and when they get to the far end, they wait for each other. When they're both at the far end, they both pick up the weight. They're able to step sort of 2 meters to one side, put the weight down, and then continue the searching. The slight complicating factor is that, don't forget, we have umbilicals attached to the diver. So the attendants have to closely control those to keep them taut enough, but not so taut the diver can't move. But equally, when the divers cross in the middle of the search pattern, the divers have to have communicated and decided, are you going under or over? If you're the inside diver, your friend's lifeline, your colleague's lifeline, because if you go under on one occasion, then when you come back you go over it, it's like knit one, pearl one. It's like knitting, and what you've done is make a big mess, and your umbilicals are basically all snagged up. And certainly when you start off as a diver, I did it on a number of occasions, because you can't see, don't forget, so it's not like it's clear water. It's total soup. You're doing this by touch, and the first you'll be aware of it is when you actually feel your colleague's lifeline probably sort of either hitting you in the face or sort of rubbing over your back or something, and you then realise you've either got to go over or under it. But if you go under it on one way, then you have to make sure you go under it on the other way, so you'll sort of briefly tangle yourself, but only with one tangle, if you like, and then on the way back you untangle it. So it takes a bit of thinking about, and it can lead to a mess. Now, if you add in the factor of you can't see, and then also if there's a bit of water flow, if you've got some a fast flowing river or some tide or something like that, that can add another element to it as well. So this did take 2 or 3 days. But eventually we were very pleased to get all 3 phones back. Now you might be thinking, well, phones are useless in the water. I think I've said this before, but actually fingerprints can last for years in water, so can DNA, and certainly with the clever policey types, I don't include myself in that, all data can be recovered from phones that have been in the water. So, if you're going to go out and do a crime, don't be thinking you can throw it in the water and that's it, sorted. That won't work. We can recover the information and the evidence from that phone. So it was vital they got those phones back, and they did get those phones back. So it was a nice little job. I say little job, nice big job if you like. Ultimately they got all the guys, they got all the evidence, we got all the phones, and 200 kilos of cocaine, taken. So it was a really good hit for them. So that was good. So there's a second job that we did with them as well, and actually a very similar one, to be honest with you. A guy that had been living in some really nice sort of penthouse flats in London, must have been worth millions of pounds a flat because London property is stupidly priced. And this guy had been large-scale dealing as well, probably similar to what we're talking about, maybe not quite as big, but certainly he'd been dealing in hundreds of thousands of pounds of drugs, mainly heroin from what I remember. And he would have a habit of using a phone to speak to his contacts or doing whatever. But this posh flat that he lived in sort of was a penthouse that was around one of the London docks, and he had a habit of every time he spoke to a contact, he would then walk outside with his phone and to different places within the dock, and same thing, take the phone apart, take the battery out, take the SIM card out and throw it into the dock. Now the surveillance had seen this, so they'd sort of marked it for use later on, and knew that they'd have to involve us, and that's exactly what happened. When they went into the arrest phase, we were then tasked with going to recover those phones, and it took some time, but I think we were there for a couple of weeks, but we ended up with something like a dozen phones. He'd regularly sort of thrown phones in the water, so we were having lots. Although the one thing I would say is I think we ended up recovering something like 20 phones, and maybe a dozen were actually involved, and then they weren't. You'd be surprised the amount of people seem to throw phones into docks and things. I'm not quite sure why, whether it's anger, splitting up of relationships or whatever, but so sometimes you come back with a load of phones, and then the techie guys and girls have to figure out which ones are actually involved, in what you're looking at. So that was another good job. What was interesting was this guy was using something, and you may not have heard of this before, and certainly, bearing in mind at this point I've been in the police for probably 20 odd years, I'd never heard of it either. It's called, well, there's different names for it, but it's Hawala banking or Hawali banking, depending on, I think, kind of where you come from. And it's quite an interesting way of dealing this. If you imagine I'm a bad guy and I'm buying, let's say, £100,000 worth of drugs, firstly, it's very difficult for me to get cash out of the country. If you take more than £10,000 out of the country in cash, then when you go through the airport, you are going to be questioned for sure. And you might ask, well, how are they going to know? Well, there's sniffer dogs for cash at airports. There's also special machines, and they have various ways of figuring it out. So you're not allowed to take a certain amount of cash, and it's quite low. I think it's 10 is the limit, although it may change, £10,000. So if I've got £100,000 worth of drugs to buy from, Afghanistan, for example, poppy, heroin or something, I can't just take £100,000 out in a bag and go and take it to my, the person I'm buying my drugs from. So I need another way of transporting that money. Now, clearly, I can't do a bank transfer for £100,000 because there can be no paper trail. I can't have, bank statements showing that huge amount of money going back and forward, because clearly it's evidence and there's going to be questions asked by various people. So this is where this Hawali or Hawala banking comes in. Now, it's a bit complicated. It goes back years and years, literally to the 8th century, and it generally originates from the Middle East. But it's used by a number of people now. And what happens is, firstly, you have to have a network of sort of trusted traders and dealers in money, Hawali sort of bankers, if you like. Effectively, that's what they are. And they have, huge funds in different countries. So I would go and see my local Hawali sort of banker, and I would say, I want to transfer, let's say, £100,000 to a guy in Afghanistan. I take with me a $1 note, for example. It can be anything, but it can be various tokens, but quite often a US $1 note is used, or some sort of, banknote from somewhere a bit unusual is quite often, so perhaps not the normal currencies, but something a little bit unusual, or a dollar. I tear that note in half, and I give half of that note to my banking contact. He now, probably not himself, but uses someone to travel to Afghanistan, and they give the person I'm buying the drugs from that half of the note. And then what happens is I then travel, or somebody, that's part of my organisation travels to Afghanistan, sees the product, agrees a price, and then when it comes to financing, let's say, okay, I bought £100,000 worth of heroin, the guy who you're buying it off wants his money. But instead of money, because we've already discussed there's all these issues about getting the money out of the country, etc., and bank transfers and what have you, I take along my ripped US note, and I give it to him. And if he has the other half, because the Hawali banker or one of his contacts has already taken it to him, has the other half, and those notes match. And obviously, when you tear, a piece of paper, you can match it, to the millimetre. It can be an exact match or not. There's no way you're going to sort of fake that. And also, quite often it's done so that it goes through a serial number, so you actually have the sort of matching serial numbers, and there'll be notes of those. As long as my RIP note matches his note, then basically he agrees it. He's happy I'm good for my £100,000 that he wants. So he gives me the drugs and off I go. Now what happens is he now goes back to his Hawali banking contact and says, here is my half note, we've agreed 100,000. And a lot of this is done on trust. You might think, well, that's, it's crazy. I bought, I don't know, a new car and it was £2,000 or £3,000 and I didn't really trust the person to just say they'd give me the money and let him take the car. But, this whole system, as I say, goes back to the 8th century, all relies on trust. And what happens is the Hawali banker in Afghanistan has had contact with the Hawali banker in the UK, and they know they're good for it, basically. So he will then hand over the £100,000 to the guy in Afghanistan. I hope I've made that, you can understand that, and I've said it in such a way that it can be understood. And then quite often it can also, if it's not just the money, you might think, well, how is the guy out there getting his money, the actual Hawali banker, how does he get his 100,000 from the UK? Well, quite often it's done off the back of other deals. And also there can be a certain amount of bartering going on as well. So it's not always money. So it might be that, if I need to get my 100,000 out, or the Hawali banker needs to get his 100,000, it might just simply be that on the next deal, and this is where the trust comes in, the banker from Afghanistan says, well, you still owe me £100,000, but I'm about to, buy whatever here, or I'm going to import something, and it's also a value of 100,000. We just call it square, sort of thing, So there's a way of getting this money back and forward. It's held in different places. It's quite often bartered for certain services, and it all relies on trust and this, sort of important token that you have to take with you that matches, and the deals are done. And I say, you might find it unbelievable in this modern world, but, we're talking hundreds of thousands, £500,000, £1 million, in cash that can be moved about in this way, just on the word of mouth and with this token, and basically somebody saying, well, I've dealt with him before, he's a trusted banker, and I know he's good for that money. And it comes down to that. As I say, it seems quite surprising, certainly to me and others, no doubt. But it does work. And what you might ask, what happens if someone renades on their sort of deal, and goes back on it, or does a runner basically and doesn't hand over their £100,000 in cash? Well, like I said, it's all done on trust, and that person, firstly, no doubt will be hunted down, but secondly, will never ever be trusted in those scenarios again. And other bankers will be told, about this guy who's sort of done the dirty on the deal. He'll never be used again. But invariably, these people, it's been in families for hundreds of years, and the whole system works on that trust. So quite an unusual one, Hawali or Hawala banking. And that's what was being used by this particular guy to move money back and forward in relation to the very large drug deals he was doing. But we recovered all the phones from that one as well, from the docs. So phones featured quite heavily in our investigations, because let's face it, we all use phones all the time for data and bits and pieces. But that's about it for this week then. I think we'll call it a day there. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting, and come back for next week, and we'll have some more. By all means, let anyone else know that you think might be interested. Take it easy. Have a good week. Cheers. Bye.